Welcome to the Three Exiles of the German-born artist Samson Schames, an evaluation of Samson Schames' art by a panel of international experts. Annika Friedman from Germany, Dr. Rachel Dickson from the UK, and Dr. Ori Soltes from the US. I will introduce every speaker before their presentation. This event is part of our online series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression, which you can further explore via the link in the chat. The speakers' presentations will be followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A, so please post your questions. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I'm now honored to introduce our first speaker. Annika Friedman has been part of the Jewish Museum Frankfurt team since 2021, initially as curatorial assistant and since 2022 as the curatorial project manager for the permanent exhibition in the Rothschild Palais. In addition to Samson Schames' Fragments of Exile, she most recently co-curated the 2022-23 exhibition Back into the Light, 4 Women Artists, Their Works, Their Paths, which detailed the lives and careers of 4 artists whose paths intersected and subsequently diverged in Frankfurt after the rise of the National Socialists. She received her Master in Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa in Israel and her Bachelor at University of British Columbia in Canada. During her studies, she was the assistant curator of the art exhibition Arrivals, Departures, the Oscar Gans collection, and a project coordinator in the archives of the Hecht Museum in Haifa. Welcome, Annika.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. Thank you for the introduction, Rachel. As mentioned, we will be giving you insights into Samson Schames through the lens of his various exiles and phases of his life and career. In a nod to the cabinet exhibition I curated for the Jewish Museum here in Frankfurt a few years ago, I conceptualized and curated the phases of his life and consequential exiles in a fragmented format, splitting his life into the 3 distinct phases you will learn of today. I have the honor of introducing you to Samson Schames and his deep roots as a German Jewish artist within the topography of Frankfurt am Main, the city he was born and raised in, his home, and where he spent the longest period of his life. Siegfried Samson Schames was born into an Orthodox Jewish family on December 31st, 1898. Whose local roots stretch back to the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto, or the Judengasse. As the second of 3 children born to parents Albert and Sophie Schames, he grew up in Frankfurt-Bornheim, to be specific on Sandweg 5, one of the centers of Jewish life here in Frankfurt. His family, through his father and grandfather, were connected to the banking world through their positions working for the Rothschild family. But Schames didn't pursue business or banking. Instead, he followed a path into the arts. Schames, the nephew of the legendary art dealer and gallerist Ludwig Schames, was attracted to art at an early age. In 1915, Schames began his artistic studies at the Kunstgewerbeschule Offenbach am Main, which I translate to the Offenbach School of Arts and Crafts. These studies were forcibly interrupted when he was conscripted for military service and served in the German army between 1916 and 1918. After the war, he continued his studies at the Kunst- und Gewerbeschule in Frankfurt, that would be the Frankfurt School of Arts and Crafts, which today has become the renowned Städel Academy. Here he studied painting, graphics, and stage design. It was also here that he experienced his coming of age artistically during the vibrant cultural era of the Weimar Republic. He became associated with the movement Neue Sachlichkeit, or New Objectivity, which emphasized realism and social commentary. His early works include landscapes, cityscapes, and scenes of Jewish life, reflecting both the beauty and complexity of pre-war Germany, or interwar Germany. From 1925 onwards, he had contact with the reformed Frankfurt Art School, which developed into one of the leading German academies. Schames, who worked as a graphic artist at the time, also designed furniture and textiles, and was active as a stage designer, and devoted himself intensely to painting from 1928 onwards. After the National Socialists came to power, he could only exhibit his paintings in exhibitions of the Jewish Cultural Association or in his own studio, which is actually just down the street from where I'm sitting today. Here, he began his exile within the borders of his homeland until 1939, when he finally fled to England. However, Schames' exile began within Germany. It also represents a reoccurring theme throughout his artistic career. Schames, despite the hardships which surrounded him, continually prioritized his artwork and found a means to reinvent himself as an artist time and time again, while using the limited materials at his disposal and moving within the restricted spaces he was allowed. In the late 1920s, Schames worked designing sets for local theater productions. However, he found this work frustrating, feeling that the productions demanded cheap effects that didn't allow him to fully express his vision. Despite these challenges, Samson's talents gained recognition. Two of his watercolors, titled Gypsy Camp and Sicilian Coast, were eventually acquired by the Frankfurt Municipal Gallery. And sadly, these works are known to have been later confiscated by the Nazis in 1937 during their crackdown on so-called degenerate art. Here we see his depiction of the Opera Square from 1930. And throughout my research, this piece has quickly become a favorite of mine, not only for its aesthetic value, but also for the stories it can tell and the pedagogical value it adds in contextualizing Schames' story. Schames' depiction of the Opera Square here in 1930 is exactly that. It's of the square and not of the beautiful opera building itself, which actually lays directly behind. That is to say, Schames would have had his back to the opera house itself in order to achieve this perspective. But I found myself asking why. This 1930 view would have been an ode to a different Frankfurt, his hometown, and where most streets tell a story. In the middle of central downtown, Schames would have frequented this square hundreds of times. However, there is a key topographical feature. Schames' renowned uncle, Ludwig Schames, who I mentioned earlier, owned an art gallery just down the street, in the exact direction the painting alludes to. That is to say, Schames was not only painting the Opera Square, he is actually giving us a very personal insight into his hometown, the streets that he walked, not only where he grew up, but also alluding to deeply personal family connections of the Schames family to Frankfurt. By the mid-1930s, the rise of the National Socialist regime forced Samson to the margins. He was excluded from mainstream art institutions and limited to working within the Jewish community. Between 1934 and 1938, he designed stage sets for the Jewish Cultural Association in Frankfurt. In 1936, he participated in the Reich exhibition of Jewish artists, at the time one of the few legal platforms left for Jewish artists. And he displayed the work that we're seeing here, the Street in Autumn, which is a depiction of the Rothschild Park here in Frankfurt from 1935. And here in this small oil painting, Schames is inarguably depicting the mood of an approaching storm. Whether Schames wanted to make reference to the political situation in 1935 remains unanswered, but it was in fact the year of the Nuremberg laws. Although Schames couldn't have known the extent to which his career and life were to be altered, the laws and their restrictions on his everyday life and livelihood directly affected him. Schames' painting, Street in Autumn, was shown in the 1936 Reich exhibition of Jewish artists at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And here again, it's important to reiterate that Schames was only able to display his artwork in distinctly Jewish exhibitions post-1935. explaining the newspaper clipping I show on the right-hand side, which was published in an exclusively Jewish newspaper in 1936. While speaking about Schames' journey, I would also like to take the opportunity to speak about the unique journey of his artworks in and of themselves. When forced to make plans to eventually escape Germany, Schames, like so many others, would have been extremely pressured to only take his prized possessions. The frame here, which you see on the left-hand side, belongs to the artwork itself, as Schames extended his painting off the canvas and onto the frame itself. Not able to roll this specific painting as he would have the Opera Square, he would have taken this piece as a whole. I say this and I mention this because I truly believe it to be a testament to his artwork and the value he placed on his prized works. The Street in Autumn has truly traveled the world, across the Atlantic and back, where we displayed it in Frankfurt almost 90 years after the newspaper article on the right. And in fact, as we speak, it just arrived in New York to be displayed in the upcoming Leo Beck exhibition Lost and Found, the life and work of Samson Schames. Here, as I mentioned, we see two figures standing outside a locked gate of the Rothschild Park in Frankfurt, their umbrellas raised against the elements. This imagery, especially understanding the central location of the park within the Jewish neighborhood Schames belonged to, symbolizes the growing exclusion and isolation the Jewish community was facing at the time. Here, it's important for me to stress that I included Germany as the first stage of Schames' exile, because it was exactly this. Exile for Schames began within Frankfurt, the city he was born and raised in, and his family roots trace back 500 years. He was first and foremost locked out of German society, and this is what the previous oil painting strongly represents. It was one of the few works Schames was able to take with him into the next phases of his exile. Here we see the document on the left is a confirmation of what's translated as the Cross of Honor, which was awarded to Schames for his World War I veterans. And as late as 1936, which was somehow especially ironic for those Jewish veterans already experiencing discrimination under the new Nuremberg laws. In addition, the identity card on the right is not a passport, although it might look like one, but rather a Reich association of Jewish cultural associations in Germany, because Schames, as an artist in 1936, was no longer able to display or exhibit his work publicly. Then in November 1938, everything changed. The Kristallnacht pogroms unleashed violent anti-Semitic attacks across Germany. Here in Frankfurt was no different. From his parents' apartment, Samson would have witnessed the destruction directly, including the burning of his synagogue, the Friedberger Anlage, from the Israelitische Religionsgesellschaft just down the street. Shortly thereafter, Schames took refuge in a good friend, Hermann Schwarzschild's apartment, who was luckily or unluckily in the hospital during that time. This moment marked a true turning point for Schames. For Schames, as well as thousands of other German Jews across the nation, it was suddenly brutally clear that it was no longer safe to remain in Germany. Schames had thankfully already been planning his escape during the year prior, including going through the Netherlands on his way to safety in England. The violence forced him into the next phase of his exile, leaving behind his mother, his sister, his career, as well as the rest of the life and networks he had built for himself over the first almost 40 years of his life. His emigration was, of course, anything but easy. Here, a document from the finance department, clearing him to take a small portion of his assets with him. The two works I mentioned earlier would have been two of the few pieces he was able to take, marking their extreme worth within his oeuvre, and also his motivation to rebuild his artistic career in the next phase of his life. And here I would say, before passing the microphone onwards, his early years here in Frankfurt played an absolutely crucial role in shaping his artistic voice, while the later phases of his exile would come to pioneer new paths in wartime modernism, beginning with his arrival in England.
Thank you so much, Annika. And we'll move on to the next speaker. I'm honored to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Rachel Dickson, who is consulting editor at the Ben-Ori Research Unit, formerly head of curatorial services, Ben-Ori Gallery and Museum in London. Her research and curatorial outputs focus primarily on Jewish immigrant artists and designers in 20th and 21st century Britain, particularly those who fled Nazi-occupied Europe. A committee member of the Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies, School of Advanced Studies, University of London, and honorary advisor to the Archives of Polish and Eastern European Immigration, Nicolaus Copernicus University, Torun in Poland, she has written and spoken widely. In 2023, her biographical chapter on émigré art historian Dr. Helen Rosenau was published in Griselda Pollock's Women in Art, Helen Rosenau's Little Book of 1944, published by Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art, Yale University Press, a publication which received the award for multi-authors volume from the Historians of British Art in 2025. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Annika, for the fascinating introduction to Schames' early life. We'll now move the narrative on to England. Okay, why are we not moving forward? There we go. So you can see from the papers that Schames eventually arrived in England in early 1939, and he settled at 5 Westheath Drive, Golders Green, in northwest London, and immediately began painting his surroundings. Located off the main Finchley Road, the area was already home to a significant cohort of German-speaking refugees, so much so that bus drivers announced local stops as Finchleystrasse. He also used a room in German sculptor Benno Alken's home for painting. And around this time, the German Jewish Aid Committee issued a booklet offering handy hints towards integration for new refugees, including that they, quote, refrain from speaking German in the streets, do not make yourself conspicuous by speaking loudly, and do not criticize any government regulations. Schames swiftly restarted his career in London, showing in July 1939 within an émigré context in the first group exhibition of German, Austrian, Czechoslovak painters and sculptors, organized at the Wertheim Gallery by the art section of the left-leaning Free German League of Culture, with which he was associated. The following March, his first solo exhibition at the Brook Street Galleries was reviewed in the Jewish Chronicle with the headline, "A Very Interesting Refugee." The writer observed that, quote, his sense of color has developed consistently since he has got away from the influence of the harshness of Pechstein and Kokoschka. The color of England seems to suit his brush, and the work done here is by far his best, end quote, further noting that, as a so-called degenerate artist, his works in the Jewish Museum Frankfurt were, quote, slashed and mutilated by the Nazis, end quote. We can immediately see that the lighter palette and looser brushstrokes of his earlier German works have become altogether more subdued and heavier, influenced perhaps by the gloomy mood of wartime London. Beyond émigré exhibitions, a wariness of expressionism was nevertheless present in wartime London. Refugee artists not only faced uncertainties of daily life in a foreign country with an unfamiliar culture and language, but the further obstacle that German art was little known and unfashionable. Even established figures such as Ludwig Meidner found it difficult to attract a new audience and to secure patronage. As the critic and art historian Herbert Reed wrote in the introduction to the 1938 exhibition, 20th Century German Art, which showcased 31 degenerate artists, and I quote, "It would not be untrue to say that to the general public in Great Britain, modern German art is totally unknown." Furthermore, in spring 1940, Schames' progress was suddenly and without warning halted as Churchill's new government implemented a policy of mass internment. At the outbreak of war, some 74,000 German and Austrians resident in Britain, many who had fled Nazi persecution, were registered as aliens and categorized by tribunal, according to the supposed level of threat they presented. With the fall of France in June and press agitation over Nazi sympathizing fifth columnists, the Prime Minister issued a decree to collar the lot. Accordingly, 27,000 were apprehended, and even so-called friendly aliens faced immediate incarceration. Wholesale and haphazard arrests took place nationwide, cutting across categories, gender, families, generations, professions, religion, political alignment, and state of health. Transit camps were swiftly established on the British mainland, some in wholly unsuitable sites, such as racecourses, a derelict textile mill, and at Huyton, an unfinished Liverpool Council housing estate, from where internees were transferred to more permanent locations on the Isle of Man, shipped to distant parts of the Commonwealth, or for the fortunate, like Schames, directly released. Schames was detained in Huyton from spring to October 1940. The camp was guarded and surrounded by an 8-meter-high barbed wire fence. Up to 5,000 men were held at any one time. Houses intended for a single family were crammed with up to 12 occupants. Nevertheless, Schames was still able to work, and a striking legacy of images remain from Huyton, where a perhaps sympathetic environment of culturally German internees accepted expressionism in camp artworks, once a lack of materials was overcome. Schames described his experience as, quote, "Not too bad. Room and board were taken care of. Models were plentiful. I drew and painted, but also made figures out of barbed wire, which I later showed in Bond Street. Since I had no paint, I made it myself. The soot of a stove, mixed with condensed milk, gave me black. The juice of beets, mixed with pulverized chalk, gave me red paint. Clipped hair attached to little sticks served as brushes." End quote. The Observer art critic Jan Gordon later noted, quote, "In an internment camp with nothing but domestic material, he painted passionate studies, and the wandering Jew made from barbed wire testifies to the real acuity of his imagination." End quote. These comments on resourcefulness and repurposing everyday and found materials to make art highlight a consistent and universal creative impulse among imprisoned artists. A number presciently brought materials with them or had them sent on, but these were a sadly dwindling resource. Instead, newspapers, toilet paper, and wallpaper peeled from camp walls were regularly used as picture surfaces, applied with these unusual pigments. When asked about using precious rations for making art, Schames replied, quote, "There wasn't so much to eat at this time, but I preferred it this way. I thought to make something positive out of these negative things." End quote. Like many of his fellow interned artists, he made densely colored expressionist portraits, as well as scenes of daily camp life. His sleeping place recalls Fred Ullman's drawing from Hutchinson Camp. "My bedroom, the artist uses his suitcase as a work surface in the absence of a table, while the oppressive blacks of Watchtower and Rumours convey the anxious, febrile atmosphere in a crowded camp without access to real news, where irrational fears take hold." As the artist Klaus Meyer recalled, quote, "The greatest fear was that the khaki uniforms of the British soldiers standing on the watchtowers were changed to the black of the SS. Fear of an invasion was very great." Quote. Released on the 13th of October 1940 through family intervention, Schames returned to Golders Green in the midst of the Blitz and immediately became a volunteer fire guard. Crucially, this role enabled him to hone a new mosaic process, building on his resourcefulness in camp, incorporating found items such as shards of glass, fragments of china, nails and stones, scavenged from bomb sites or picked up on Hampstead Heath and embedded into the picture surface. Furthermore, as a fire guard, he was eligible to show in the Civil Defence Artists Selling exhibition at the Cooling Galleries in Bond Street, which presented 20 shows between 1941 and 44. In 1941, Schames also made 3 unsuccessful applications to the War Artists Advisory Committee to be an official war artist. His German nationality cannot have helped. As many commercial galleries were closed during this time, the CDA provided a much-needed outlet, its opening catalogue proudly announcing, quote, "The first exhibition has an importance, actual and theoretical, which it's difficult to exaggerate. For the arts are part of a world which we have lost and are determined to regain," end quote. The CDA was supported by the War Office and the British Art Establishment, including Sir Kenneth Clarke, director of the National Gallery, and several distinguished painters. Initially focusing on painting, drawing, and sculpture, shows gradually embraced stage and poster design, illustration, photography, and murals, and accordingly Schames broadened his own contributions to reflect his versatility. As a painter-sculptor, he entered works mainly across 2 themes. Firstly, the almost abstract views of the devastated city, often bisected by jagged diagonals, primarily in tempera and gouache, sometimes using collage or sand, from a series he titled Bond London. And secondly, the trauma of Jewry, images of persecution, exile, and death, explored in his fractured mosaics. In the second CDA show, he showed the unknown, a powerful mosaic of an outstretched hand, outlined in wire, as his, quote, "monument to the unknown dead and injured of the raid and war," end quote, while the Daily Herald praised a Christ-like head, yellow star, composed of rusty nails, haloed by a Star of David, noting the recent order in Germany, which compelled all Jews to wear the 6-point star. The Hampstead News called Schames' method, quote, "austerity art." In September 43, Schames' solo show at Alfred Wilson's Progressive Bookshop in Hampstead included permanent waving, his collaged view of a smashed hairdresser's window, suggesting the continuation of daily life, while also perhaps recalling the shattered windows of Jewish properties during Kristallnacht. The 13th Civil Defence show included posters, stage designs, and photographs, in quote, "an attempt to show the artist's work used in some specific and practical manner," end quote. Schames showed a poster design, Civil Defence Comforts Fund, with black lettering set against a background representing a bomb burst. An unusually colourful internment image, curtain for the camp theatre, and 10 drawings entitled, "What Colour Is It?" Quote, "clear-cut, amusing and instructive, illustrating objects with common colour, probably for educational purposes," end quote. In the final CDA show, he presented snowdrops, depicting US military police in white-tipped uniforms on a London street, representing Anglo-American cooperation. Following release, many interned artists moved within the same émigré circles in London. In April 42, Schames held the first of 2 solo shows at fellow internee Jack Bilbo's newly opened modern art gallery, the venue for moderns. Bilbo, an exuberant character, had organised art exhibitions in Onk and Camp on the Isle of Man. Schames presented mosaics alongside heightened images, the catalogue noting, and quote, "It's refreshing to see the works of Schames where the restrictions of internment have not deprived him of the language to express his emotions, where charcoal and paper stained with vegetable juices speak more eloquently than aureolin on expensive canvas," end quote. As Schames later recalled, he felt no disjunct between works made in internment and those which followed. All were suitable for display together, even in the smart environs of the West End. Although Schames and Bilbo were both Huyton internees, Bilbo's wife Owo recalled that, quote, "Jack and I did not know Schames prior to opening the Modern Art Gallery. He just walked in one day, as did many refugee artists, happy to find a home from home." The gallery and the Bilbo's apartment became a sympathetic German-speaking refuge for émigré artists, and as Edith later observed, quote, "This was the beginning for everyone who had no name, even Kokoschka," end quote. According to Bilbo, Schames was the first artist he accepted into his new venture, marking the start of a close friendship maintained through the Schames move to America, from where Samson continued to write affectionately to the Liebe Bilboim. Other organizations providing wartime opportunities included the Left-Wing Artist International Association, sometime partner to the Free German League of Culture. Schames membership enabled him to publicly align with its anti-fascist stance, and its often thematic shows allowed him to confront the most traumatic subjects in his work. In 1941, he showed ruined buildings in the exhibition of war pictures in the ticket hall of Charing Cross Underground Station. And in 1943, he presented hostages shot in the church's Varabima in the much publicized For Liberty show, held in the bombed basement of the John Lewis store on Oxford Street. Simultaneously, Ben-Uri provided a useful outlet. Established in 1915 in London's East End ghetto as an art society supporting Yiddish-speaking Ostjuden migrants, mainly from the Russian Pale of Settlement, and excluded from the British art establishment, it pivoted in the mid-1930s to support German-speaking émigrés. Schames exhibited 6 times between 1944 and 50. In the summer 1944 exhibition of painting, sculptures, and drawings by contemporary artists, whose catalogue acknowledged the, quote, total destruction of Europe by the Nazis, he presented contrasting works, the aforementioned Cenotaph and Street in Corsica. Inevitably, the predominant style was expressionist, and the catalogue highlighted an extraordinary level of émigré participation, with more than half the 52 exhibitors having fled Nazism. As the war ended, portraits by contemporary Jewish artists included a vigorous self-portrait shaving, with Schames contemplating his foamed face with outstretched hand and quizzical expression, along with a drawing of a Mr. Wurmser, possibly Leo Wurmser, pre-war repetiteur at the state operas in Vienna and Dresden, who fled to London in 1938 and later worked for the BBC. 3 years later, German émigré art historian Dr. Helen Rosnau highlighted Jewish artists from Germany in the AJR Information, describing Schames as revealing in London, quote, his originality by making mosaics from the debris of air raids. Quote, the text positioning in a Jewish publication, however, underlined the fact that much of Schames' success in English exile lay within specific contexts created by war or by his Jewish, German, or refugee identity, not necessarily as a modern. Beyond these limited opportunities, he showed once with the Progressive London Group in its 1945 exhibition, held at the prestigious Royal Academy. And in 1948, his Euston Station was accepted for the annual Royal Academy show, a high point in the very English summer season, just as the couple prepared to emigrate to New York. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And again, we'll move on right away. Last not least, I'm honored to introduce our third speaker. Dr. Ori Soltes teaches at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., across a range of disciplines. He's former director of the Bnei-B'rith National Jewish Museum. His most recent exhibition, co-curated with Rachel Stern, is Identity, Art, and Migration, which includes the work of Samson Schames. As co-founding director of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, he has spent 25 years focused on the issue of Nazi-plundered art. Soltes has authored or edited 31 books and scores of articles and exhibition catalog essays. Recent volumes include The Ashen Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust, and Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture. Welcome, Ori.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all three of you and with our audience, and to carry Samson Schames into his third exile into New York, to which he arrived in 1948, although it's interesting that in his memoir he says 1949, which was written in 1964. So I'm not surprised. When people ask me, when did you start teaching at Georgetown? I can never remember exactly what year it was. It's always this or that. So I suspect that he either slightly misremembered the year of arrival or it was on the border from 48 to 49. So either would work. Who knows? The point is we see him here painting again. And we see him also depicted here looking a bit the worse for wear. Look at the rings under his eyes. He looks very tired. With the last image we saw showed him shaving. He's unshaven here. But I also want to call to your attention just behind him a self-portrait that looks very much like the photograph that he had done. Because when he got to New York, over the course of the next 17 or 19 years until his death in 1967, this was his third phase. It was his last exile. And in a sense, I think he may have hoped it would be a kind of homecoming, that he'd refind roots in New York, in the Jewish world, in the art world. He might remind some of you, apropos of the identity art and migration exhibition and discussions that we have had, of Arthur Schick, who had also been through various places before he came to the United States, or of Rudi Lesser, who, having moved during the war to Scandinavia, ended up actually coming to the United States after the war, which is, of course, the case for Samson Schames. The difference, of course, is that Lesser ended up going back to Germany by the mid-50s, and Schames stayed here. It was a time for self-reflection, so that we find him writing memoir in the 1960s, mainly 1964, in which there are a number of things that we find. One is a passage in August 1964 where he talks about his bitter disappointment at the fact that his Christ with Thorns that he had done back in the London phase had been rejected by the Museum of Modern Art, even though the founding director, Alfred Barr Jr., claimed he liked it. In the letter he wrote to him, I have suspicions about that. My committee rejected it. I can say I really liked it. My committee rejected it. Because I think someone as powerful as he was, I think he could have had the work there. And I think for whatever reasons, he didn't want it there. But here's the thing. Schames says, I was optimistic up to that point. Then I started to feel bitterness. This is one of his visual self-reflections, because, of course, he began painting self-reflections and not just writing about them. This is from 1950, and you can see it's watercolor and pencil, but I'm curious about his continued emphasis on a lot of blue. You might have noticed that in the images that Rachel showed us as well. Blue in London, blue here, and I can't resist the jump to Picasso's blue period, although it's not as intensely dark blue, but this sense of feeling sorry for oneself or dissatisfied. And that would not be entirely true of Schames. He hoped he would have a reburgeoning of his career along the lines that had been skyrocketing in the early phase in Germany, as Annika shared with us. But coming to the United States, he's coming to this much larger and chaotic place, bringing with him his memories and his awareness of what's been going on, and a tendency toward figuration and also towards reflecting the Jewish experience in a world in which, as New York is becoming the center of art, its center of art style is abstract expressionism. And as much as abstract expressionism reflects on the world of explosion from Auschwitz to Hiroshima, most of the critics and art historians looked at it and saw it as completely abstract with no reference points at all in the outside world. They were wrong, but that's not the point. That's what they thought. That's what most of the world thought. In any case, we see him here confronting us, as it were, in this 1950 self-portrait, but in the self-reflection of 1964, which was my beginning point, where he talks about his bitterness regarding the rejection in the early 60s from MoMA. He also writes in his July 8th entry, very comically almost about his uncle Ludwig, this wonderful figure who was very crippled and who did not succeed as a businessman. And yet he really put Frankfurt on the map as an art city. And he writes about that lovingly. He writes about other artists, other gallerists, rather. He writes about his experiences in Germany and in London. And this would be in July. In August, he writes in that entry about his mother, that he had received word back in 1954, because remember, this is a reflection back over decades that he's writing about, of her having died at Theresienstadt in February of 1948. And he discusses his younger sister, Louisa, about whom he knew nothing. She had been separated from her mother. She disappeared, no word about her. And he worried and he hoped, he said, that whatever happened to her, she died quickly, lest she have suffered at the hands of the SS. So he's writing in 64, reflecting on his life, his times from Germany to England to New York. He has in New York a limited degree of success, but not perhaps at the level that he'd hoped. And his self-reflections are reflected not just in the verbal memoir, but of course in his repeated iterations of visual self-reflection. So here you see a 1963 pen and ink drawing. So just a bit really before the memoir from which I was roughly quoting, as it were. And you can recognize that same sort of face that we saw in the second photograph, with the very dark, heavy eyes, rings under them. The hair not gray at all, by the way, but a sense of tiredness. Like Arthur Schick, among the other artists that in the IAM exhibition and discussions we have referenced, he maintained a very, very strong Jewish identity. In fact, the first exhibit that he had here in 1950 at the Karlbach Gallery was not just Jewish in content. Its title was A Monument to Hitler's Infamy. So it was very much reflective of his continued reflection on the suffering, not just of the Holocaust, in the Holocaust, but more generally of the Jewish community that he knew and loved. But as you follow his trajectory through these New York decades, it becomes less or not as much about Jewish suffering, that is about this kind of work that you will recognize from his England, his London period. This is a 1944 execution. And as Rachel pointed out, he's using rusty nails, he's using pieces of steel, rusty sheet metal. He's using the detritus that he found on the street after the bombings, which was innovative of him. But that's changing as we come here and we find his interest more not in Jewish suffering, less in Jewish suffering and more in Jewish celebration and continuity. Here you see a watercolor. It's a design for the Habonim, the builder's synagogue. It's stained glass windows. That's what he was creating in 1951. His designs were not chosen. Someone else got the commission. So again, success, but not success. He came back to mosaics again, but of a very different sort. So first of all, this is a real mosaic. That is to say, it's made of pieces of glass, cut glass, that he has embedded in their cement, as opposed to the mosaics that he was making of detritus, which of course dominated the London period. And the subject is one of a pair that were done in 1956 for an exhibition at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York on the Jewish holidays. So you will recognize that this is a man blowing the shofar. So it's clearly for Rosh Hashanah. And the second work that was part of his contribution is of a man kindling the Hanukkah candles, also same year, 1956. And the interesting thing to me is two things. One, the colors are so beautiful and bright. It is such a light-filled world. It is so different from the darkness that we've seen up to this point. And the two of them, I don't have them juxtaposed. You have to do it in your minds. This is an exercise for everybody. They almost make a because the two figures are kind of opposite each other, with each of them emphasizing this wonderful, embracing, curvilinear arm, this very warm, ingathering kind of arm. And that's something that I'm going to bring back in just a moment. There's also a lot of emphasis on yellow, which, as you know, is, of course, not just historically, going back to the medieval period, a color associated in Christian Western art with Judas, with betrayal, and with Jews. But the culmination of that handling of that color, of course, comes with the yellow star that is imposed upon Jews by the Nazis. Here he's taken yellow and he's put it in our face, but not as a damning yellow, but as a glorious golden kind of yellow. And of course, the mosaics as a medium, it seems to me, are particularly appropriate to his Jewish concerns. They're made up of all these broken pieces, and yet they fit together to create complete images. So they are both broken and complete in a beautiful way. And he was also, during this period, doing images of churches. There's a beautiful one of a church that he did in Paris, trees, of figures and the like. The world around him, always in a very interesting, different kind of way. This is a painting done of the number one train, the riders in the subway train in the mid-50s. And again, you'll see that emphasis on yellow. But the first thing that occurred to me when I saw this painting was, oh my God, it looks like a Last Supper. And then I realized, okay, technically, we're missing a figure at each end. But the central figure, am I not seeing a bit of a halo there? Is there not some sort of a conscious or unconscious allusion to that kind of an aspect of human experience that has been translated into the very mundane reality? What could be more mundane than the subway? And if you've been in the New York subways, I don't think you will ever have looked across and seen 11 figures lined up so neatly, because people are chaotic and there's bars in the way and there are hangings in the way. But I think there's something else going on here that reflects his interest in playing with different kinds of ideas. Let me enlarge this for a second. And this is another New York scene. It's a railway bridge. And this dates from the same time period. And okay, if I didn't say it was a railway bridge, would you be able to identify it as that? You might figure out something in that ballpark, but you'd understand it's something constructive. But essentially what it is a kind of symphony of these rectilinear elements, these diagonals, these very eloquent diagonals, and the horizontals and the verticals, again, against a kind of goldish background, but with a darkness to it. So a kind of dialogue between dark and light. And it strikes me, if I think of this in comparison with the images of Rosh Hashanah and Hanukkah that are so curvilinear and have that softness, that this offers, by its rectilinearity, a contrastive sort of hardness, you might say, almost abstract. And the thing is, success, not as much as he hoped for. Success, not just within the Jewish New York world, but within the artist Jewish world, because he wasn't restricted to New York. He went out to Provincetown and other places on the Massachusetts coast in the summers where the art scene moved to from New York. He was very much part of that. So you see, for example, here, Fishing Village from 1953. You can see it's watercolor on paper. It was torn right at the edge off a pad. And you can see here almost again of abstraction. If I don't tell you what it is, will you be able to identify what it is? If I didn't give you the context, would you be able to say, oh, of course, it's a boat docked in the harbor for 1952. And this was actually part of the exhibition that took place in the summer in Provincetown, the Provincetown Art Association, the first 1953 exhibition of the 39th season. That was June, July. Then there was a second exhibition, the second part in August. And in the second exhibit, there are 151 works. In the first, there were 166 works. Artists like Chaim Gross, like Wolf Kahn, like a handful of other well-known Jewish artists. So he was very much part of the scene. I would call him a kind of Grenzjude, that is a border Jew, in the sense not of the way of intermediating between the larger world and the Jewish world, although that's part of what he does, but between the different worlds of exile through which he moved and through the figurative and abstract worlds through which he moved visually. You see here a still life from 1959. He did many still lifes. It's a gouache. And I don't know at first glance whether you'd identify it as a still life. It's like, wait, what? Oh, now I see its flowers. But there's almost something threatening, almost like a Venus flytrap kind of movement for the figure in the center leaning over towards the right, and a tarantula-like look for the floral element on the far right. So he's very blue, a lot of blue there. He's very border between his satisfaction and dissatisfaction, between his success and his fear, his sense that he doesn't have enough success. This is the Granite Quarry, 1958. It's Hussein on board. Again, very abstract. What could be more emblematic of a quarry than that it seems to be made up of earth and sky? You have the tawny colors of the earth, of the stone. You have the blue above and below. And there is what would appear to be a kind of horizon line. Well, if that's the case, then the blue above and below, conscious, unconscious, I'd never got to speak with Samson, so I can't answer the question. But you think of the beginning of Genesis, and the waters are separated by the rakia, by that which separates the waters above from the waters below, because in Hebrew, the word for heavens is waters there, shamayim, the waters below, the waters above. And it seems that he's playing with that idea. And by the way, he received a prize with this work, the 1958 Grumbacher Kassein Prize. So the Grumbacher company that produced that Kassein element with which artist works would give a prize with $100 that came with it each year to the artist who most effectively made use of their medium. And he got a prize that year, the year of the painting for that. Or this, it's simply called abstract composition, white, green, black, gray, 1959, also Kassein on board. But again, it's completely abstract, and yet I cannot help but see snow-covered mountains pushing up, but not to a blue sky, but a sky that is much more complicated. It somehow feels representational to a certain extent, even though it's so obviously abstract. Trees, figures, nudes, and of course, above all, we come back full circle to where it began, self-portraits during this period of increasing self-reflection that culminates in the last 3 or 4 years of his life in New York, as I said, including that memoir of 1964, and including this work of 1963, pencil, ink, watercolor. Again, even here, notice the blue that is so obvious. It's exile, it's returning home. It's a rebirthing of his experience as an artist and as a Jew and as a Jewish artist in the US, but not to the extent he hoped for. He dies in 1967, so give or take 18 or 19 years after his arrival here. In the course of that time, he had about a dozen exhibits. There was that Carlbach Gallery exhibit in 1950. There was an exhibit in 53 at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. In 54 at Carnegie Gallery in New York, he had a one-man show. And also at the same time, in that same year, that is, in Paris at the Galerie Bernheim, an exhibition. The following year, the Frankfurter Kunstkabinett did an exhibit with his work in it. In 56, an exhibit he was part of at the Old Customs House in Philadelphia, and also at the Jewish Museum in New York, the only time they exhibited his work that I know of. 57, an exhibit in Este Gallery in New York, one-man exhibition. 58 was when he got that award for the Grumbacher Kassein Prize. 59, another exhibit at the Este Gallery, one-man show, and also that year at Bezalel, the Bezalel National Museum that had been founded by Boris Schatz in 1906, that would become, as it were, the the Israel Museum in 1965, but at that point it was still the Bezalel National Museum. He had a one-man show there. And again, in 60, he won the Grumbacher Kassein Prize again. And finally, the year of his memoir is the year 64, when he had exhibits at the National Arts Club, or was part of exhibits at the National Arts Club, at the New York City Central Gallery. And it's also right after the period of his rejection from MoMA. And I looked at this self-portrait. I find it so appropriate because of the way the head is twisting. It's as if it's pulling away, the way he's dealt with the tendons of the neck, pulling away from the past toward the future, pulling away from the present to the past. There's a kind of pull that goes back and forth there. And at the same time, in this self-portrait of 64, one done in the year of that memoir, we see something a bit more straightforward. We see him staring out at us very bravely, very hopefully. The same year he did a design for a Torah art curtain, which was never made. But I'm reminded by the Torah art curtain of the theater curtain that Rachel showed us. And across it, he had written the words in Hebrew from Numbers 24, Matov Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. How wonderful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. Very positive. This was someone who was supposed to, Balaam was supposed to curse the Israelites, and instead he found himself blessing them. I find when I feel his life in his New York era, there is a sense of being cursed with what he's received and being blessed with what he's gained. It's somewhat analogous to his comments about how Germany had inadvertently given him a gift. He died in 1967, and the posthumous rebirth of his recognition comes almost 20 years later, when the first major exhibition of his work in 89 takes place, yes, at the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, which brings us full circle back to where Annika began, in a sense, and leaves things open to the question of his success, failure, satisfaction, dissatisfaction, his Grenzjude personality in so many different ways. What a character. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ori. Before I ask a question, I want to greet Jonathan Green, whose great-great-great-grandfather was Ludwig Schames, the art dealer, and the uncle of Samson Schames. So welcome. This is wonderful that you're here. And I thank you so much to all of you for these very enlightening presentations. And I'm wondering, picking up on your Grenzjuden, your definition, Ori, of Schames being a Grenzjude, meaning embracing, being a Grenzjude. How do you think that his Schames being Jewish and wanting to be, or being an international artist for not just a Jewish artist, but recognized by the international art community. How did that play out in the different exiles for him? And that's a question for I guess Annika and Rachel, and for Ori, if he wants to.
I don't mind starting, and maybe have Annika and Rachel add. You know, every artist is three things. He or she is the individual, and he or she is part of whatever group or groups that define that artist. My gender, my race, my nationality, my religion, any of those things, consciously or unconsciously, can feed into what I do. But if I'm really going to succeed, I also have to be a universalist. I have to speak to the world and not just to my group, much less just to myself. And a thinking artist, and clearly Samson Schames is a thinking artist, is thinking about the ways in which he can do that. And he clearly feels, when he's in England, part of his job is to try, and I would think, and Rachel, you can add to this, especially after, even though it was relatively brief, his being put in the camp, that he realizes, no, these people don't really understand what we're going through, what we've gone through, what we're suffering. And I think he would have carried that with him when he got to New York as well. But eventually, I think in part because he realized Americans they don't look past. You know, you think of the United States by 1950, no one even remembers what the word Nazi is because they're worrying about communists. So our allies during the war are now our number one enemy. And all that is going on in the 50s with respect to Joe McCarthy and that sort of stuff would push against much of an interest in things having to do with the Holocaust. But then you look at the wide range of the kind of work that he did, and he addressed it. I think those last paintings are stunning. But then it becomes in part a matter of luck, doesn't it? So Clement Greenberg and Hal Rosenberg think that Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman and Jackson Pollock are the cat's meow. They have the power to have them become the center of the art scene. If he hasn't managed, he being Schames, to find his way into the favor of Greenberg and Rosenberg, and he couldn't. Once he did anything Jewish, they were so uncomfortable with their own Jewishness that he would have been persona non grata for them. And so, in spite of that, he was quite successful. But because of that, he wasn't as successful as he might have been. So part of the Grenze is between the success and the not success, the border.
Mm-hmm. And I then pick up from Ori and go back to the issues in England. And I think it's very much as I touched on, Schames was able to have his limited success in England in an environment where German art was completely unknown. But he was able to have these success within these kind of limited contexts. So great for him that he was a fire guard and he got to display his work within the context of the civil defense artists. And that allowed him to push subjects that ordinarily, I think, you know, the British public, who at that time were really tending to love art from France and enjoy a much more aesthetic type of art, wartime at least allowed him to push subjects that were ordinarily pretty traumatic. But you can see he's also still nevertheless caught within those contexts of being German, where he exhibits with the Free German League of Culture, where he has left-wing support, and he shows with the AIA, and then of course with Ben-Uri. And Ben-Uri perennially has this problem. You could see from the catalogue how many émigré artists were showing in one exhibition. And this is because it was an environment that was safe for them, that understood the journeys they've made, the trials that they've overcome, and the kind of subjects that they were dealing with. But it wasn't part of the mainstream world. And for example, I mentioned Ludwig Meidner, who was also an exile in London, and he was an artist who had a great reputation before he went into exile. He was in exile for 12 years, so even longer than Schames, and he had one exhibition in those 12 years of exile. So he's a very similar case to Schames. He was a very observant Jew. And he said of his one exhibition, which was held at Ben-Uri, that it was about as successful as a second-class funeral, because Ben-Uri was very limited in the audience that it was able to cultivate. So you have Schames stuck within these contexts. Then you see just towards the end of his exile, he's starting to branch out into kind of more mainstream activities with the London Group and the Royal Academy. But within the whole kind of context of global art history, by then the conversations really moved on to New York. And for any desire to be a modern, you can understand why he wants to cross the Atlantic. And as Aria said, the timing was just terrible.
Mm-hmm. Annika, do you want to add something?
I think I can add a little bit. I liked Ori's distinction between the different factors that all émigré artists face, and I think it's all of them are so relevant to Schames. What came to mind with both of your editions is Schames was first exiled here in Frankfurt as a Jew, as a Jewish artist, not as an artist, but first and foremost as a Jew, although Germany and specifically Frankfurt was the only home he knew at the time. And he served 2 years in the German military, but he was obviously ostracized as a Jew. Then he makes his own way to England, his second phase of exile, and there he's never felt more German before. He wasn't placed in Heiden camp as a Jew. He was placed there as a German, as the threat of being a German passport holder if Germany were to invade. And then again, I struggle within my research. I always struggled whether to name New York as a true third phase of his exile. I wasn't sure if that was my right to label that for him, but it was so clear to me that he never felt truly at home in New York either. That was truly a third phase of his exile. And there, I see from your presentation as well just now, there he was ostracized as being in some way for his art form, and then very much for the Jewish themes that he was known to have depicted in earlier phases. So when we talk about Grenzjude, I think even more so, it's less that he was on one side of this supposed boundary at any given time. It was more that at any given time he was dancing on that boundary and back and forth and back and forth, and he was so truly affected by the context that he was stuck in. I liked that wording. It was truly so much of his narrative was out of his control. But I think that's truly why I find myself continually so impressed with him, as I obviously never had the honor of meeting him either. But from what I've researched, I'm just continually so impressed by his motivation and his drive to constantly do the best he possibly could as an individual and as an artist and as a Jewish artist with the circumstances that he was dealt.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, and I mean you also I think it's important to remember that every exile every one of the three exiles that he experienced came with a lot of insecurities, a lot of fears of in Germany of being arrested and deported, and in England of being deported back to Germany, and in the US he also had a green card only, and that is not a secure situation for the years until he became an American citizen. So I mean, and this insecurity and that fear, I'm sure he carried that most of his life, and I admire him for always putting art first in all situations, and which shows him, identifies him as a real artist, because that's the language he communicates with with the world. So I also noticed in your presentations that he seemed to have carried, like expressed the themes that he started out with, whether it was stage design, which he didn't love, but kind of embraced, and his paintings, and then later his mosaics, his work with found material, that he carried that through all phases in his artistic development. So, yeah, do you?
I always think of, there's that phrase they use in biology, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So, you continue to represent and become more of what you always were. Or Aristotle, the idea of nature in Greek, physis, it is the nature of the acorn to become an oak tree. So the oak tree is implicit in the acorn, in the acorn. And he, of course, mentioned that he was like an old tree growing new branches. So I think of him that way. So yeah, I agree.
It was really interesting, Ori, to see some of the later abstract works in New York, because it reminded me so much compositionally of the bombed city.
Yes.
The images there are so much bisected, dissected by these dramatic diagonals. And I
Yes.
always wonder, did he ever look at Japanese prints? That kind of work, because that way of dividing up the picture surface is so different from a kind of conventional use of perspective. And I wondered whether that was ever something that,
Yeah.
I don't know, that Ludwig had in his collection, or I don't know, Annika, if that's ever anything you've come across.
Well, Chaim Gross was very much taken with East Asian art, from Japanese to Javanese. And I know that he knew Gross, but I don't know how well. So I don't know if just as a minimum, he would have visited his home and seen that sort of stuff. Just a possibility, but I have no hard evidence of that. Maybe Annika does.
I don't have any hard evidence specifically of any Japanese influence on his artwork specifically. I think what I saw specifically in the examples you both chose to use is the reoccurring theme of fragmentation, and the way he depicts that throughout the latter two phases. These aren't nearly as prominent in any of his the few works remaining from his time in Frankfurt, and I think that was truly something that he came to terms with as an emigrant from Germany, and something he dove into in his time in England. And it's especially interesting. Someone commented already in the question, the question portion here. I think it is something he truly grappled with until the end of his life. I think, I mean, there are so many different metaphors we can use here, but he was truly an immigrant until his dying days, and we see that through his mosaics beautifully. There are very few remaining memoirs, so when we're quoting his memoirs, we're all quoting the same memoirs. But there's a specific section that stays with me, that he refused to continue to work with mosaics the way he did in his detritus era after the Blitz in London. But he did reformat his use of mosaics in the two beautiful stained glass mosaics that we have here in the collection. That you show that can be backlit, and they take on a whole different character. But again, they're an ode to this former era of his, but they have a very different lightness to them and a color, and so he was always in a state of transformation, reinvention.
Right. So Susan is asking, he doesn't seem to depict any family members or friends after his exiles. What was his personal life like after he left Germany in 1939 and after?
Well, he mentions how, when he says Germany gave me a gift inadvertently, and it's Edith, his wife, and he says, I never would have been what I was. I never could have done what I did. I never would have survived emotionally without her. So clearly, she was very important to him. And in New York, there's some I guess it's from New York, the photos of them in the booth, the photo booth thing. And there's one, actually, I guess when they got married, where they're wearing, their faces are in the holes in these flats. Is that was from? Am I right about that? But she clearly was very, very important to him. He did do human figures occasionally. I've seen a few, aside from the self-portraits. There's one nude that I know of. There are probably more, but there's one that I've seen. He also did very eloquent trees, going all the way back to Germany. His thing with trees. But I don't know if either of you knows of more familial imagery specific.
Or in terms of not familial, but in terms of a kind of emigre group, he clearly, through the friendship with Jack Bilbo, that connects him with an emigre group, and that friendship, as I mentioned, continues into New York. So I think that was a very important friendship group, and Bilbo was connected with a significant number of emigres, including Schwitters. And although we don't know specifically whether Schames met Schwitters, it's highly likely that, given the exhibitions that Bilbo had and the kind of private views he was having in the very small circle of artists he showed, and you have the impression Bilbo opposite to Schames, Bilbo wrote an autobiography that's that fat. And it's incredibly kind of egotistical, but that's kind of what you need, although you have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. But you can see that the artists that he showed were his friends. It was always an incredibly personal transaction, personal relationship, that he believed in these individuals not only as artists, but as individuals. And he completely understood the journey that they had gone through, because he also was a persecuted Jew. And then I came across a portrait. It's a bit of a mystery, but it's a portrait of Schames, and it's by an emigre artist called Hugo Dachinger, who was also interned. And it's held by the archives on the Isle of Man, but they say it's a portrait from internment, but it's dated 1941. And we know that Schames was no longer interned in 1941. So I wonder if it's just a portrait of Schames by Dachinger, who was also released then, and it's somehow ended up in the archives and has just been mislabeled as an internment portrait. So he was clearly part of that kind of emigre circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also can comment that that there are many supposed depictions of his wife Edith, many nudes, which I've been told by family members it might or might not be Edith, but that's definitely not my role to ascertain that. The very beautiful candid photos that we have are obviously photos and not necessarily in his artwork to be seen. What I find especially interesting is although Schames didn't paint his close family, his parents, his brother who died quite young, and his sister, that there's very often a very personal touch in the landscapes that he depicts. There's always a story or two behind the scenes, and of course one could say that of many artists. I find it especially interesting because Shames's family is quite small. It's been very incredible over the last few years to kind of a little bit of detective work to find these stories and to understand the deeper personal stories behind, for example, the depiction of the street in autumn, which we know to be the Rothschild Park, and all of a sudden an entire new narrative opens up. We know the historical context. We know that those are streets that he walked down. It was very much central in the beating heart of his neighborhood here in Frankfurt. So these doors are open to us through his artworks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just going very briefly back to the trees, we know that he made a painting of trees on Hampstead Heath when he was in London. So that subject, which becomes very important to him in America, has roots in Germany, and it's then followed through into the UK. And there's a press comment about his painting of trees in Hampstead, about how important it is for beauty to carry on during conflict. And I feel there's definitely, that's something that Schames is trying to do, although the beauty may often be a kind of spiky, double-edged kind of aesthetic.
Right. So my last question to you comes from the audience, and where the question comes up where David asked the question, could Schames' life be remembered as a triumph, having overcome so much trauma and carrying on? I mean, I personally am impressed how many exhibitions he was in, or he had one-man exhibitions, which very much separates him from other exile artists who had to go through the same exiles. But I would like to know, as a final question, what you think about this.
Absolutely, with a footnote.
Okay, go.
No, that's it. Absolutely a triumph. And as I think all three of us emphasized, but Rachel in particular emphasized his resilience, because you were talking about it in the context of what he was doing when you quoted from his memoir, what he was doing in the camp, making colors and making brushes with cut hair. I mean, he kept bouncing back. How could you not view his life as a triumph? But neither would I be surprised at his comment at how he finally felt bitter when MoMA rejected that work that supposedly its director had said, I really like, but whoever it is, we've rejected it. Of course he's going to feel that. And just by the way, I bet Picasso to his dying day never felt that he got sufficient recognition. So there's, in his case, there's an ego that can't be filled. But in almost any artist's case, there's always more that you wish you somehow could have had. But from where I stand, man, triumph, absolutely.
Yes, I second that, and I'd say it's borne out by the fact we're having this conversation today. I mean, that's a wonderful legacy, and it's just a shame that circumstances dictated that there isn't necessarily enough tangible legacy. It's much easier to sum up an artist's life if you've got a full catalogue. I mean, from what we've seen and what we've discussed, there's really a very limited number of works that are trying to tell this very complicated and nuanced story. So yeah, triumph, definitely, over adversity.
Yeah. And I highly recommend three things. One, if you can get your hands on the 1989 catalog of the exhibition that the Frankfurt Jewish Museum mounted. There you go, there it is. The Leo Baeck Institute exhibition that is about to open, and of course what Rachel mentioned at the very beginning, which is the session. Is it the 17th of September, Rachel? That involves family, friends, to enrich one's experience of him.
Yeah, and
would it be possible? Sorry.
Yeah. Please, Rachel.
I was just going to ask whether it might be possible to be in touch with Jonathan, the family member, because obviously those of us who are researching Schames are always keen to find copyright holders and to touch base with family members. So maybe Rachel Stern can pass on our details to Jonathan so we can kind of join the circle.
Yes, of course. I mean, we should have said from the beginning Rachel D and Rachel S. I realize, but it's okay, I think. Thank you, everyone, for this stimulating transatlantic conversation, which very much enhanced our understanding of Samson Schames and in the historical context, as well as the relevance of his art today. And I hope this is a beginning, really, of a deeper exploration